founding the company as a small founding team into where they are today, some of the challenges they've had, some of the successes they've had, some of the programs they've put in place to do that. Gareth, I always love his story because he worked in the wind farm industry for over a decade before he founded a company to build software to optimize wind farms, really understood that. And we always talk about problem-driven innovation. So understanding that customer problem, I think, was pretty easy for you, right, Gareth? At least
yeah.
Solving the problem was the challenge, right? But at least you understood the problem. Charles somehow got lured out of making video games. I think that's what your background was in, into designing software that now is being applied to visualize, mining and resource challenges, to optimize those sort of activities. Gone are the days of probably the ping pong tables, and a little bit more serious now, Charles.
I actually just got a ping pong table 2 weeks ago, so
fantastic. So
pretty stoked about that.
Yeah, so those things that keep people motivated and excited. Sometimes it's those little things that make an organization fun and keep everyone motivated and happy. As always, everybody here is here to support you. So feel free to jump into that chat box and ask your questions, right? They want to help you through the challenges. They don't want to answer questions from me. They're not, though they enjoy talking to each other, as you can see from our little Lego conversation before. Really, they've taken some time out of their day to provide value to you. So please do take advantage of that in the chat box. If you are not asking a question, it's a fairly small group. You can unmute yourself to ask some questions if it's appropriate. Please do keep yourself on mute to avoid any background noise. We will be recording this session for posterity and for those who were not able to attend today. Any other questions or comments before I turn it over to Valerie to get started? All right. With that, I will turn it over to Valerie Henderson.
The questions are already coming and I haven't even started in the chat box, so I'm not sure I can keep up. But we'll go through that. I was asked how I got into HR. I just will tell you quickly, I got into it completely accidentally. My degree is actually in marketing, a business degree, and I actually have a minor in computing science. So I think I'm the only HR person who's written a relational database, but I will tell you it was in PL1 on an MTS mainframe. So for those of you, it's been a while. I actually went to A&W, had a CEO that came up from the HR, and his successor, he was about to retire. His successor, the EVP, had also came up from HR, which is incredibly rare. But A&W had probably leading edge HR practices. And I actually applied for a marketing job, but at the time I was working for Chevron. And they said, yeah, you were doing the marketing and the wholesale for the trucking and the forest and the mining industry. It's not exactly the same as consumer package industry. So I didn't get the job. And then they said, how would you like this HR job? And I went, I've never done HR before. What did they do? And he said, well, no, we think you're a good fit. We can train you on that. And I said, well, okay, we'll do it for a year. And then I'll see if I can get back into marketing. And that was in 1990. And then I worked for them for 4 years, and I learned a lot. But I was traveling 35%. So I wanted to start my own business. I had looked for part-time work and realized there was this big gap, and which kind of segues into where we're going to talk about. At the time, back in 1994, people thought HR was either a labor lawyer or a recruiting agency. People didn't realize that there was actually more to HR than keeping yourself out of trouble or hiring people. And the big companies had large HR teams, but the small companies needed the same in-house HR support, but on a part-time basis or on an as-needed basis. So my marketing degree, which actually focused on business and strategic planning and writing business plans, came in very handy. I went off and I did the market analysis and realized there was a huge need for it. And literally once I got out there and once I could explain to people what HR was, they said, well, this is great. I've always wanted to have somebody. And so it took off from there. And having the minor in computing science, the tech industry found me, and I've probably worked with over 100 companies in the Vancouver tech industry. A number of them have gone on to be incredibly successful. And so that is my focus is on the startup. So that's a little bit of my background. And now I'm going to share my presentation, and let's see if this is all going to work as planned. Okay, great. So I'm going to go through this, and then I do have the chat box. And what I'm going to do is talk about some concepts, and then Charles and Gareth, I'm going to have them come in and support. So once I've talked about a concept, they're going to come in and share their personal experience with this topic for a couple minutes, and then we'll move on. And you can ask questions as they're going in the chat. The chat box is only, I can only see so many at a few times, and they're coming in fast and furious. A couple of you have, well, actually there's been a number of comments on how do I recruit. So we're talking about all of HR, not so much specifically on recruitment. So even though I don't have specific slides, I'm happy to talk about what's happening right now. It's an area that I spend a little less time on, but I certainly deal with the retention and once they're in the door. So go from there. Okay, so just a little disclaimer, I am not a lawyer and I'm not giving any legal advice. This is talking about HR practices. And while we might end up talking about some legal concepts, it's really, I can share some general, but if you have a specific issue, it's really important that you retain your own counsel for that. So that's just my disclaimer. We're going to cover the HR life cycle in part 1, and then the engagement level. So, what does HR look like in your organization and when? And then we'll focus on some HR issues that have come up, either ones that I have seen through the various companies I've worked with, or Gareth and Charles will jump in and talk about their own personal ones. So what is HR? I remember one of my clients, when I came in there, one of their engineers said, well, the only exposure I've had to HR is catbird. So I knew I had a little work to do on explaining on what HR does. And for those of you who don't know who catbird is, it is evil HR director for Dilbert. So it's a little bit different from that. But some people still see HR as a compliance and keep me out of the law and keep me out of the court. And it's more than that. So it is that you do as a basis, it's a necessary but not sufficient. You need to make sure you're compliant, which includes making sure you stand up to employment standards, human rights, WorkSafe, BC, privacy of personal information. There's a number of regulatory bodies and laws that you have to follow. And I find a lot of time companies where you've got a founder and it's in the early stage, they're not aware of what's required. And so some of the times when they're out of compliance is generally because of lack of education. I think any owner wants to do the right thing. And sometimes it's just, I don't know what to do. What is the right thing? And the other part is it's going to cost me X. And it can be expensive, but I'll tell you, investing in making sure that you're doing it right is going to pay off down the long term, because I have seen where it hasn't been right and it's cost tens of thousands of dollars in lawsuits and bringing things into compliance. So this is definitely where you want to make sure you start off on the right foot. Once you've got that in place, then there's that kind of daily performance management. How do I make sure my employees are doing what they're supposed to be doing? How do I make sure they're paid fairly? How do we develop them? So, once we've got them on and recruitment, how do we get them on board? How do we make sure that things are humming along fairly smoothly? The employee relations is also important, because you do need to have, you will end up with employee problems. They might be small, they could be very large. And you do need to have somewhere they can speak with. And if it's not somebody that's in your organization, then there's sources outside of that. And then the last part is, the big part is the strategic and all that cultural part and employee engagement. And right now, for most of the organizations that are working with Foresight, that's long term. And but you can still keep it in mind from your daily, what you're doing. You can still make sure that you can think about, we may not have clearly defined what our culture is, but most founders have an idea of what's important and what are the values. And when you're recruiting people and when you're training people and you're managing people, you want to make sure that really end to end, everything is consistent with those cultures. The ongoing part is coaching, which happens every day. A lot of founders are not experienced in managing people. And I have worked with so many of them over the years, and you're all incredibly brilliant. And I so much admire the work you've done and some of the products you've brought to market. And it's really just harnessing that brilliance and intelligence that you already have, and knowing how to use it in a different way. Okay, so talking about the life cycle, I think this book is about 25 years old now. I don't know how many have read it, but Crossing the Chasm talks about, in particular, tech companies where the product's life cycle has always been around. It's classic 101, business 101 in university. And there's always been innovators and early adopters, early majority, late majority, and the laggards. That, regardless of the industry, has always been around. What Jeffrey Moore proposed is, in the high-tech industry in particular, there's this chasm that the move from the first two early adopters to the early majority is much more difficult in the technology space because of the completely different needs of early adopters and early majorities. And I'm sure some of you are starting to experience that. If you're starting to grow, you're starting to experience that. So what I'm going to ask Gareth and Charles now is to tell us about a minute about what is it like being in the chasm. Talk to me about, you've got your few customers and now you're ready to go out. Tell us a little bit about what it's like to be in the chasm. Charles? Or Gareth? I see he's taken him off mute. Gareth?
Well, yeah, I can jump in. I mean, it's interesting that on the chasm side, I mean, just to give it a little bit of background on myself, just because I think context is key on all these things, on needs and challenges. I was working as a consultant in the renewables industry on wind and solar farms. So I joined a startup in the attic of a church in Glasgow, and then worked in Europe for a couple of years. Then I was in India, China, Sri Lanka, working on projects out there. Then came to the Americas, and from the consulting engineering side, set up operations in Chile, Mexico, Brazil, US, and Canada. So I had this wonderful experience of working on projects around the world, but from an HR perspective, hiring staff in new markets, hiring teams, and everything else. So I had a good experience of being in a company which went from 20 to kind of 400 and being involved there kind of 2005 to 2016. So when we set up the business, we had to go out and find clients for the first time and find staff. So the chasm, I would say, it's, I don't know if we're still there. I don't know where it starts and ends, but I just emphasize of just being in that kind of high uncertainty zone where you're trying to get all your processes and everything else in place, and going from that kind of small scale of kind of 5 staff to where we are 70 staff is just your needs are going to change dramatically there, and you're going to have to change staff along the way, because the skill set of having 5 staff or 50 is very different there, whether it's in the executive or in the management of that team, and the same for your processes as well.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. There's a fundamental shift in being simple and kind of doing things by the seat of your pants to actually having to have some processes in place. Charles?
Yeah, I kind of second what Gareth is saying. I'm not sure that we've necessarily crossed the chasm. Like, we're still in that chasm, but starting to get those early adopters and building that early majority. But the thing that we've been kind of really hammering in the last 2 years is getting our processes in place and really enabling the HR mechanism to work properly, so that we can help our employees grow and put the right people in the right place. And one of the early kind of feedback or mentor kind of comments that I really sticks out of my mind from the early days of starting the company, he said, the people you start the company with are not the people you're going to build the company with, to grow it. It's not, you don't necessarily have the same people at every stage. And so it's knowing when to kind of grow into that next stage and get different people and move those people into different roles, right? And put the folks in the best place they can execute on what they are best at.
Yeah, those are two key themes. One is getting the processes in place and moving from being able to do something fairly ad hoc, and then realizing that because this is such a big change fundamentally, you might have to, turnover is actually good. And so a lot of people say, well, I keep recruiting and keep turning over. Well, if you are growing fast, good turnover is okay to have. And so a lot of the companies have to, in incubators and organizations where they're getting support, and all of those different kind of networking groups tend to be around here. And so that's where I'm going to focus today. And I've worked with companies in all of the stages, less so in the bigger companies, but more on an assistance basis. And so if we look at some of the innovators, these are often serial entrepreneurs. They've got some war wounds, and they see HR as a value, not a cost. And so the people that bring in HR right from the scratch really want to be ahead of the curve and have already planned out their long-term vision. And I have one company that I worked with. I have one amazing woman who her first company, she brought me in at the 25 because she was stuck in the chasm and that we had some HR issues. She did an incredibly successful exit and then took a year off and then kept in touch with me. And then she said, I'm starting my second company and you are the first person I'm calling. I came in at day one. This was 2016 when she started her second company, and it was her and me in a large room with nobody else. A great view of Burrard Inlet, but that's it. And we brought in everything. We brought in an HRIS, we hired the right people. And one of the really benefits that paid off from that was that there were virtually no fires. We had some turnover, we had some mishires. We were able to attract good talent quite quickly because we had started our branding and we brought some people in, and ultimately we ended up in a lot less cost. Sometimes I can stay for a while with a company because I'm fixing things before we actually start forward looking. And but we brought in a co-op for marketing who turned out to be an HR, who turned out to have also a dual degree in HR. And we ended up working with her, who is now the manager of HR for the company. And so they were able to, they're now 90 employees. And so they're now able to, they look great. And the cost of HR are a lot less by bringing in it earlier. A lot of the times I'm in early adopters. So they bring it in a little bit, they bring me in around the 15 to 20 employee mark. Again, they've probably had some success, so they still see it as a value, but they want to kind of try their hand at it a bit. They've brought in people they know through their networking. They might have left a large company to start their own company. And when they come in, they bring a team with them. Hopefully they're not violating their non-solicitation clause, but they come in and so they do that. And so it's still okay. It's still proactive. There might have a few fires have started. We're starting to think about prevention. So it's not too bad yet. But then we start crossing the chasm as well. So if we wait until early majority, where for me, that would be kind of that 40 to 50 employee mark, they tend to look at HR as a cost. And so we spend more time than we need to retrofitting HR and replacing things, putting in policies because people have gone by the seat of their pants. We've got a number of maybe a few employees that should have not have been hired, or some that we should have let go and earlier. And so that's when we've crossed the chasm, and it becomes much more labor intensive because we're retrofitting. I won't spend a lot of time on some of the other ones, but when you get into the late majority, then to bring in HR at that stage is far too late. If you're talking about 100 employees, you should have had HR. I've been there where people have called me up and said, oh, we've got all these problems and we need you in. And usually the first thing I do is I try to hire a full-time HR in-house person and work with them. And we do a lot of cleanup. So we spend a lot of time doing that. And then the laggards at the end are the ones that they've probably had at least one HR lawsuit. HR is a necessary evil, and I've been brought in kicking and screaming. And so the earlier you can bring it in, the better. And the nice thing now is that if you look at the engagement levels, you have a lot more flexibility than you did when I first got in it in 31 years ago. So again, when people thought about HR back then in the 90s, it was like a labor lawyer or a recruiter. And they would say, I'm not big enough to hire a full-time HR person. And now it's not just me. There are many HR consultants and people who work on a part-time basis who specifically are an outsourced resource for you. And there's typically two parts of it. One is to get you set up, to make sure that you are compliant, to have all your forms in place, to your employment agreements and your handbook and your WorkSafe BC and your first aid requirements. And then also to start identifying what is your brand. Let's create a recruitment branding program. So how are we going to go out there and find the people that you need? And then the second part is the ongoing. And this is where you've got a lot more flexibility today than we had a number of years ago. So if you're really fairly, once we've got you set up, if there's not a lot of recruiting and you are able to, things are going okay, you can probably just do on-call, and you can find somebody who will come in as needed. And really up to 25 employees with a low activity level, you don't need a regular HR person. If you start getting a little bit busier where you've got more people, it could be 10. If you're doing a lot of recruitment, which I've seen in the chat box that a number of you are really starting to grow, you probably can have a part-time person available and somebody who is specialized, a generalist. But if you are really growing, you do want to hire somebody who's got some recruitment experience, not just put up postings and look at the resumes that come in, but also who's someone who's much more available to be proactive and go out and do the social media searches and the LinkedIn searches and to help you find that. And so there are resources for that. And then if you, again, depending on your level, 25 employees, or it could be 100 employees, and if you are starting to be active, then you really do need to have an in-house person. It can be either an administrator, a generalist, or an HR manager. And I've done a transition for, I hired 4 HR generalists, and I've just hired, as of Monday, an HR director for a company. And so that's within the last 14 months. I've hired 5 now in-house HR people for companies that have made that transition and they're ready. Any questions or so far? Anybody have worked with an HR person or have some experiences?
I can share a little bit from our side on what we did. I mean, we didn't bring in, say, HR or the people on culture side until we had about 60 staff. I think part of it is driven down to what folks' experience are coming in and what the management team already has in-house, which I think is a really important piece on what you need to bring in for support is, where are you at with your management team? Sometimes you're going to have any expertise in people and culture that you want to bring in outside. But I definitely say that having our leadership team living and breathing the people and culture, the values of the business, leading recruitment there has really helped us get a diverse, inclusive, I say successful team in place. Today, we made the decision to bring in-house because we wanted to drive inclusion and diversity, knowing that we're looking at Series B. How do we go and hire 100 staff? Mm-hmm. That we were kind of forced into that. It kind of forced our hand that we had to put that centerpiece there of how do we keep this the values of our company pushing forward heavily there. And say our investment in HR has just been the management's time on the cultural side, but particularly our core values and making sure that that's front and center in everything that we do. It's interesting seeing some of the questions on the chat there on how do you go out and recruit. I mean, the biggest thing I'd say from where Clear's got to its 70 staff is the leadership team has owned that. So reaching out on LinkedIn, having conversations for those qualified candidates. I know you might say that isn't my job. I should get a recruiter in to do that. But I say the impact of having the CEO reaching out to kind of hire somebody into the team is very, very great marketing, that people feel valued there. And is if you want a great team, it's probably something that's worth spending your own time on as well. So I just emphasize how important it is for the leadership to kind of drive that team.
That's a great point. If the company has an HR resource, even if it's part-time, and you've got somebody with who's in part of the company, when candidates see that and they know that there's an HR person in house or even involved with the company, you don't have to tell them it's part-time, you don't have to tell them it's a consultant, but when they see there's an HR resource in place, then that puts you up a step ahead of other candidates anyway. Just had a couple of questions here. Is there a guidebook for smaller companies, 10 people or less? Yeah, so on my website, which I've got at the end, I have a checklist for companies on, it's not a legal document, what it is, it lists all of the HR things that you need, and it's ranked into must have, nice have, and you should have, and it's for two. One is for small companies and one's for companies that are poising for growth. So there is that guidebook, and then my contact information is at the end of this. And then the second one, another question: how does an HR consultant support performance management given that they don't know the employee or their performance? I have gotten to know the employees because I'm typically working with companies under 50. I've actually gotten to know them over the time. So if it's an as needed basis, I'm usually dealing with the performance problems. But what I am doing is I'm coaching the managers on how to do proper performance reviews. And we'll talk a little bit about the concept of performance agility, which has come out in the last 5 years. And so if I don't know the employee, I'm coaching the manager. And if I've got an ongoing relationship, I do know the employee and I get to know them. So hopefully that answers your question.
Charles, have you used outside consultants for your business?
Yeah, so when we started, we had basically a employment lawyer kind of help us navigate that, like make sure that we have the right employment contracts in place, IP contracts and all that kind of stuff. So that kind of gave us a leg up. And it wasn't until I'd say we were about like 10 people that I was like, okay, this is starting to take a lot of my time, like in terms of managing human resources and recruiting and operations and culture and that kind of stuff. And when we started the company, culture was like at the top of our list. We wanted to build, a strong culture company because we wanted to have fun as well. So that's when, maybe we went a slightly different route, but we found somebody that was really talented and had the indicators of like, yeah, this person can grow into an HR leader and they'll grow with us as a company. And she's been our office admin and manager since, and she's now doing her certified professional HR program, and she's killing it. She's like top of her class, like 100%, which is really proud to see because she's gone through, the experience, and now she's like going and getting certified. And it's like, yeah, of course you're killing it. You've been doing it for 4 years. So that was kind of our journey so far.
That's yeah, that's great. There's more education now in HR. You get a business degree. The only HR courses were organizational development, but now there's actually courses specific for human resources and human resources technology. And the CPHR of BC, the Certified Professional HR Association of BC, provides a lot of courses open to members and non-members. And so I've also worked with people who are like Charles said, they had the aptitude for people, the aptitude for it. And so we brought them in, and then that co-op again had taken a couple of courses and then now is the HR manager. So if you have somebody in-house who has the aptitude, there is a lot of courses and support out there so that they can actually work towards their designation.
Mm-hmm. And it lines up with like what you're saying in terms of like stage, because we're about 30 people. And so now she's becoming like an HR professional
Yeah.
But she knows everybody. She's grown and built with the culture and everything. So it's kind of the best of.
And I think, yeah, on Charles' point, I think that's a key. Like as I say, we struggled ourselves going with the part-time options, and these has been, yeah, living and breathing the culture when we're saying our values are front and center. I think that's where I think, Valerie, when you talk about that example with the 90 staff that they grew to and you were really successful early on, it sounds like you've been working with that CEO before, which is obviously really helpful for knowing the values and the team, which is it's a good leg up to kind of start that process.
Yeah, so I knew her, as I said, her first company, which she did a very successful exit. I came in at 25, and she had an EA who was not trained in it, who was not very good at it, and I did a huge amount of cleanup, and I actually stayed until they were 225, which is unusually high for me. But I ended up hiring an HR generalist and an administrator and a corporate trainer who reported to me, working 1 day a week, and then 2 days a week, and then I finally put in a VP of HR at the 225, and then they sold it. They sold it at about 325 employees for $400 million. So and so she took a year off. So that was why she said, I need you to come in. I need you to come in as person number one, not employee, but person number one. And again, I stayed for about 3 years on a full-time basis, and now occasionally the now manager will call me and say, can I run this by you? So I still have an advisory relationship. Just a few humorous anecdotes about making sure you get it right. I think it was Charles that mentioned bringing an employment lawyer, maybe it was Gareth. And getting your paperwork done, that is critical, and labor lawyers will do that. They also tend to not necessarily be user friendly so you get these 14-page employment agreements. And so I like to remind lawyers that we're dealing with people, not laws. But a couple of anecdotes. I went to one place. I've gone into a couple of companies, and I see employment agreements on things such as they've got form.com in the header or the footer, so I know that they've got them off the internet. Another one said it was enforceable in the British Virgin Isles, so they had brought it from some unknown spot. So people bring the materials that they have, but they don't necessarily have them reviewed. A couple of handbooks. One handbook was one that I had written about 10 years prior, and I could tell because first of all, I recognized it, and it had all the same spelling mistakes that I had 10 years ago, but the laws had moved on, and so they were very proud of their handbook. And I said, well, I'm proud of your handbook because I wrote it actually. So I said, where'd you get it? Oh, I don't know, we hired somebody and they said they had a handbook. And I said, okay, well, it's out of date. And then the other one, the ones I get are the ones that pull off things from the internet. So the handbook obviously was from the States, because anytime I've Canadianized US companies, so I've Canadianized the subsidiaries. And so I'm quite familiar with things like you take out the at-will clause, you take out the drugs and alcohol testing clause, and you take out the bring your gun to work policy. Those usually have to come out. So I've seen people pull stuff from the internet, bring things in from previous companies, and then run with them without having an expert look at them. So I highly recommend that you make sure that you have proper things in place, which is number one on these kind of the issues that have come up. And so make sure that you have a template, and it has to be executed before the first day. The number of times that people hire somebody, get them started, and then have their employment agreement signed, it's not enforceable. So if you've limited the termination to the minimum required by employment standards, and they signed it after they started, then you have to fire them 4 years from now, and it's unenforceable, and you suddenly realize you owe them a lot more than you thought. It's really, really important. Or the non-compete clause is not enforceable. So, making sure the processes come out. The big one that has come up for 2021 is the temporary layoff clause. I don't know if anybody went through the layoffs and all of the, March last year when the world was changing. I was probably full-time in March sorting things out for companies. And people read in the employment standards that you can temporary layoff people with no notice. And so everybody was doing that. But there was a court case that now the interpretation is that you can only do that if you actually have it in writing that it's permitted that there is a temporary layoff. So hundreds of companies thought that they could just lay off people in March last year and it wouldn't be a problem. And they found out incredibly the hard way that it was not cut and dry. HR is never cut and dry. They had two competing laws. One was you were allowed to lay off without notice. The other one was constructive dismissal. It requires notice. And unfortunately, they overlapped. And so we ended up with a big mess last year. So I think it was Gary, you shared that you've got your compliance in place. So any other stories from Gareth or Charles about your experiences on making sure that you do it right with regards to the compliance?
Yeah, I mean, we were in a position, I mean, we took a view early on that we didn't want to do a handbook early on in the company, and because we just felt like we just want to focus on a culture that kind of trumped and process. So what we did was we did end up having some processes in place, like our employee agreements were reviewed, like as a startup, a software, taking investments from VCs and everything else. We have to make sure that our employment agreements, our IP protections and everything else, and our process there of getting it signed before people are on board is well understood. What I would say though is on the handbook side, we kind of forced into it with compliance for kind of SOC 2 from a security perspective and stuff. We had to start introducing handbooks and that actually in the last few weeks. But saying we didn't have a handbook, we did have a series of processes in the company internally that we did have to document. So we haven't been caught with our pants down yet on any of this stuff, but it's gone reasonably well there. I do find that the discussions with the lawyers are always looking at the worst case scenario on some of these things, so they always want to go through in lots of detail there. But we've been able to avoid any issues to date. And I say we're just one example without going to full-blown handbooks early on and stuff like that. But our employment agreements are very clear on terminations and stuff like that. And we've obviously let people go and everything else in the business without being sued so far anyway.
Yeah, on our side, it's interesting because we're kind of going through the SOC 2 and ISO certification now. And so I actually didn't know there was a bunch of HR requirements for that until 2 weeks ago. And I'm like, oh man, this is a heavy lift. But so not to kind of repeat what Gareth was talking about, but I think one important thing to kind of keep in mind is that founders and kind of the co-founders are employees. And so think about what kind of contracts are in place for founders and co-founders as well, right? One thing that we didn't do right off the bat until we had an investor was sign over all intellectual property that the co-founders brought, right? And so there was quite a bit of kind of reworking our agreements as a result of that. We just had to sign everything over, right? But then there's also, equity or options consideration for those kinds of things, right? In exchange for bringing different things to the table. What does that mean? And then also reverse vesting. One hard lesson, well, it's not that hard, but that I wish I had been told earlier is that reverse vesting of your agreements should be re-upped before they expire, or any time that new money comes into the company. And I think that's a lesson that everybody should heed. And
Yeah, absolutely. And a handbook doesn't have to be formal. It sounds very formal. The analogy I use is that the human body, we have a skeleton, and when the skeleton is like HR admin, when our body is working, we don't even notice we have a skeleton. But if we break an arm, we know it. So when the admin and all the paperwork is working and in place, it becomes invisible. It actually is to your benefit, because if you don't have these policies in place, regardless of whether you have just a few, as Garrett have, or a formal handbook, people are going to be taking up your time with questions, Or, I mean, one of the biggest ones I find is when I've gone in and looked at existing employees and it's being done without thinking about it, is everybody's vacation allotments are all over the map. And it seems like we've negotiated every single one of them and we can't track them. We don't know who's got what. And then somebody comes in and says, well, I have, how come he's got so much vacation? The other issue is on compensation. So you go and pay what you think you need to get without actually putting a structure together. And you can almost tell it's like an archaeological dig. The people that were hired during a recession all have low salaries. The people that were hired during a boom have high salaries, and there becomes inequity and people find out about it. And then you end up with high turnover, people complaining, and the amount of time it takes to fix it. Again, I've gone in and found these compensation structures would make no sense whatsoever. So even though it sounds like putting in process might be bureaucratic or putting in a handbook, if you don't have them in place, you're a lot worse off. And so that goes into the so human rights and making sure you have all of that in place. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that unless anybody has questions, but just suffice it to say, if you don't have things in place like this, then it becomes a bit more challenging. The 2021 issues that I've been running into is ergonomics and safe work environments at home. And so that, people are sitting on their couch with their coffee table and then making a WorkSafe BC claim because they've got a back injury. And then again, and the other one for 2021 for privacy of personal information is when you've got all these people working from home, you need to make sure that they have secure, so their own information is secure and that you're not getting hacked through somebody's refrigerator, her smart refrigerator attached to their computer in their home office. On operational, so we talked about performance management. There was one question on that. I want to talk about, and then having something in place. I want to talk about, good talent is still hard to find right now. And I'm sure with the chats, people were saying that they're having hard times. And so you want to make sure that you know what the market is out there. And then you want to make sure that you manage the performance for remote workers. It's a little bit more challenging when you're not seeing anybody. And I want to talk about the concept of performance agility. It comes out of agile development. So everybody is probably familiar with that annual review that could be 2 to 9 pages where there's some check boxes and some ratings and everybody dreads the whole process. Whereas now more companies and big companies like GE and Microsoft and Adobe are moving to the performance agility, which is shorter, more frequent conversations that are not focused around ratings. And I have four key questions that I sit and ask people. What have you accomplished since we last chatted? What are your gaps and how are we going to address them? The second part of that sentence being far more important. What support and resources do you need from me? And let's agree on what your top priorities are until we chat again. That's it. And then occasionally I'll put in some other ones like, what are your career goals? Or is there some training that you need? But for the most part, most managers I know have regular meetings with their employees, whether it's monthly or weekly or quarterly. And so we're really not asking a manager to do anything different. But what we're doing is we're saying, take one of those meetings and really sit down and make sure that your employee is on track. Just like software agility goes and fixes things as we're going along, it's much easier to work with employees when we know what their priorities are, because everybody's busy. And so if they have to start making choices on how they are going to use their time, you want them to choose the higher value activities. And so it sounds like I've got to talk to my employees more often. This sounds like a lot of work. It's actually less work because you should be having regular conversations. These are the types of programs that you can advertise in your recruitment strategy to say, that career development and one-on-ones with your employees. There's a lot of those things that you can put into your postings as to part of your culture that will help you attract those talent. People will read that and say, hey, I have an opportunity here to go and learn and develop my skills. Because when we look at some of the recruitment, that's some of the issues. On training and development, I've noticed probably when I put up a posting, an increase of about triple of how many out of country resumes I'm getting now, because people think that, oh, I can just work anywhere in the world because it's all remote. And so and some of my companies I'm working with are starting to hire more global employees. They can do it as a contractor. They don't have to be here. So we don't have to get work permits for them because they can work remotely. And so that's another part of it. I will, the 4 questions. Okay, what are the 4 questions for performance agility? What have you achieved since we last chatted? What are your gaps and how are we going to address them? And gaps doesn't mean performance. Gaps could mean we just haven't had a chance to do it yet, or we've changed priorities. What support and resources do you need from me? And let's agree on what your top priorities are until we chat again. And then one question is about, maybe just go back a bit, just a sec.
I can talk on the international question if you like.
On Africa, okay, yep.
So we've got we've got staff in South America, Europe, here in the US and Canada. We're just about to hire into India. We should be in China by the end of the year as well. So what we've done historically, like I used to work for a global consultancy, so I was pretty comfortable putting folks on the ground historically when we're going to probably not always compliant in everything we did historically with the local rules and regulations. We have started using agencies like Papaya. So Papaya is a global employer who will give you employment contracts in every country. You pay a premium for that, but you don't have to deal with a headache from a legal standpoint on the ground. But then we manage the performance reviews and the other aspects of people and culture out of our Vancouver office there. So it's in a consistent and global way. But yeah, I know the folks that we've hired into our people and culture team really appreciate the kind of frameworks that Papaya have. And who can have your employees for you, the employment contracts with them, but you're responsible for kind of paying Papaya to bring them through, and it's all above board and legal there. So it's been a good approach for us.
Okay, Charles, have you had any international experience?
No, not so much. We've mainly kept our employment, in Canada. But it's something that we've been looking at, and how do we build offices in the markets that we're going after, because that is key for success oftentimes. But if we were to do that, I think what we would probably do is, work with local experts in those markets to kind of set us up for success, as opposed to kind of doing everything from the ground up ourselves.
Yeah, there's I've worked with I've opened an office in Mauritius and Australia, England, and a few others, and I've brought in a local HR resource. There's a lot of information online, like most countries pull off their they've got their employment standards and all that. So what I typically do is we'll read enough to just get my head around it. I don't pretend to be the expert, but I at least want to get the concepts in place so that when I'm working with a local person, I know that I can trust what they're saying, and I can ask them a few questions, and I can also understand the differences that I'm going to need to communicate back to the BC. So the Mauritius one we opened from start. We had to move expats there from another division, and we hired locals, and I worked with a management consultant there, but I did a lot of the research my own, just to make sure that what we were doing was culturally it was the same culture. We kept it consistent across the company. One question is, do you centralize performance reviews done by your staff for the subordinates? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
Hey, I'll try and say it. I was trying to figure out how to write it really concisely, and I'll speak maybe from my personal experience, is that I have a management team and I do their performance reviews, but they themselves, and I track that and I centralize it for myself to review how they're doing and whatnot. But I'm curious about when they hire staff, so my staff, and they do their own performance reviews of their staff. But currently, I don't even look at that. I don't centralize their feedback of their staff. I leave that entirely to them. And I'm just curious on what best practices in regards to that.
Yeah, so waterfall. So there's no point in the person at the bottom getting the review first before we know what the top is doing, and one of the things that employees need to know is, what is my work, how does my work contribute to the company? So if I'm doing it in a complete isolation, then that doesn't work. So I typically say the top, you should do your direct reports, because you will have, there's company goals, there's division goals, so you work your way down. And so that by the time the people at the bottom level are getting the reviews, everybody else has had the people above them have all had their reviews for two reasons. One is practice what you preach, because I often see that the junior people get reviews and the top people don't, because the senior managers don't do it. And also that you can communicate, you can communicate what the values are as they're going, and then you can also, and then what I use, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Rockefeller habits, where they have the meetings, the stand-up meetings. And so what it is every group, so all the, let's say the bottom 4 teams, they have their stand-up meetings, and then those team leads have their stand-up meetings, and then the team leads, all the supervisors have theirs, and then the managers and up. If you do it that way, so information goes up. If there's a performance issue, let's say somebody is short of some resources, so we've got a team that needs a new piece of equipment, that goes up the line pretty quickly. So it doesn't mean you have to read everything, although as an HR person, I typically will read the performance agility, I call them check-ins, Adobe uses that term. I will read those check-ins and I will bring to the attention to management any issues. If you don't have an HR person, what I would suggest is that when you sit down with your supervisor after they're all done, is that you say, I need you to tell me about anything any issues that came up that I need to know about. So
the performance review at the person at the bottom gets fed up to some centralized place.
Right. Oh, there's a great book that Charles has, Scaling Up. Yes. Yeah. So you do the performance reviews from the top to the bottom, and then you ask all the teams to move the information back up afterwards, so that you say, okay, what issues came out of your reviews, and work it way up. And
just to give you like on what we're doing it clear as well, is to share some quick context there as well. Like on those performance reviews, yeah, it's centralized. We're using EOS, similar to those 4 questions there. It's every 90 days, all the goals of the staff and their performance reviews are tied back to the company review as well. So our 3-year plan, our 1-year plan, every 90 days, everybody has a plan in line with that as well. So it's kind of tying everybody into that cadence. At the end of every quarter, everyone has been updated and moved forward from there as well. And we feed back, so in a centralized way, all the way through the end business. So I just wanted to give you that kind of context where we are.
Right. Question on 360s. If you Google that, you'll find a lot of pro and a lot of con on that. And my own personal one is you need an incredibly high level of trust. I would not roll it out right away. I would try to at least get that performance agility working where you've got regular communication. If you don't have that trust, people will not say what they really feel, or they'll unload and dump in a very unhealthy way. And so what I want to do is I don't want the dump part. And so I want to make sure I have a high level of trust. And if I'm going to do 360s, it's typically, it's difficult to do. It's incredibly complex. And some people really like them and some people really don't like them. So again, HR is always gray. There's never a yes or no. Another question.
We've seen with the execs, it's really hard to get feedback as well. Just to say, you've got junior staff trying to give you candid feedback. So 360 has been helpful for us where you need that anonymous feedback. I don't like anonymous feedback because it's really hard to action on, but it's better than no feedback. So when you're a CEO or a CFO or whatever it is at your firm and you're very senior, to get people to be very candid with you can be hard at times. So where we found it helpful to clear has been on those 360s on that side.
I would absolutely use an outside resource. I've done a number of them. And then because what I do is I take all the verbatim comments and then I create a document that the employee can read that's helpful and word it in the right way. And I can follow up with people one-on-one to seek more information. And I can do the way that also respects the confidentiality. One question, company values. Can you share the best practices of how they're built into HR processes, including recruiting and retaining employees? They have to become the fabric. They have to become just completely embedded. So you don't just create them and then pop them up on your website and say, here's my values. You need to, once you've identified those values, then you need to say, how do they fit in the recruitment process? what are the questions I need to ask to test those values? So if a value is trust, then, you know, an interview question might be, tell me about an experience where your trust was challenged with somebody that you were working with. How did you handle it? So there's questions that we can, once we've identified it, we build those questions into the review process, the recruitment process. A&W is one of the areas. They used to call them climate goals. So back in the 90s, I said they were leading edge. They had company values long before, and we actually had what were called climate meetings twice a year. Every team had to go and evaluate how this team was doing on the values, and an assessment, and then have a climate meeting to discuss them. And we gave every single employee in the head office, which was 120, not the restaurant side, every single employee in the plus the field, so 120 employees. We actually gave them training on how to live and work values. And it was accepted that if I had an issue with a senior manager and I was a file clerk, I could go to that senior manager and say, I'd like to give you some feedback about something that bothered me. And it was accepted. It was completely embedded, and we trained everybody in it. So it's not something you can just post your values and hope for the best. You need to be constantly measuring it, training on it, talking to people about it, and asking questions.
Just quick on the clear context. Yeah, we use values in our hiring on those 5 values in the performance reviews, and in every decision that we're making in the business, it's front and center. And I think, hopefully, if you speak to any clear employees, they'll espouse that. And it's how we've attracted staff. I'd be very clear. Obviously, climate change is a huge flag bearer for us to be able to hire, but inclusion, diversity, innovation, all the impact and communication, the other core values, and they're not just words. There's also definitions below them. So when we assess them with the questions, they're linking back not just to the word, because that often means many things to different people, but they've been described in specifically of what that means for the business. And it's I think it's really important. It is the culture for your business, and everything should tie back to it.
Charles, have you incorporated the values in your company?
It's been a journey. I mean, from our standpoint, like, you know, when we were starting the company, it was like values first. And, you know, how do you define values when, you know, you have aspirational goals of like building this company, but really it was, yeah, I mean, the first kind of couple of years, what we did was kind of a group session in values definition, like what are everybody's like core values, and tried to find overlap and drive that like kind of from the top. And then now it's definitely more of you know, where do we want to go and what values do we need to get there, that helps us achieve, you know, our destination, and then align that with who we hire, how we interview, and how we performance rate folks. We used to do 360. Definitely don't recommend it. That's like something that I learned at Microsoft and EA. It's way too overburdensome, like way too heavy. So we're still kind of refining that process. Like, what does performance evaluation look like today, or like now as a process? Yeah, so it's, you know, I think the key is that you should always be trying to strive to evolve and grow and better the process, right? Like nothing is ever set in stone, and nothing is ever, just because you have something in place doesn't mean it's the best it can be. So it's iterate, right? Learn what you can every year, look back on what you did, what worked, what didn't, right? And try to improve that process. And that's even the thing with like Scrum and Agile methodologies. They're not perfect, right? So you have to make them your own and adopt them and iterate on them.
Absolutely. There was one comment that 360s get done once and never discussed again. Same with the annual performance review, right? Everybody sits down, and then in the olden days, you got a printout and it went and sat in your shelf, and that was it. And so whatever you do, as Charles just said, well, the whole thing is performance agility. It's like HR agility, same thing. You change, and you're flexible, and you see what's happening, and you find out what the issue is. And another comment here, leaders need followers just as much as followers need leaders. One of the coaching I also do is called managing upward. I am a big proponent of no whining. by employees, I am a really big proponent. So my deal is, if you're going to whine about something and I wanted more money, or I want a promotion, you get an unlimited time. Like you get one free meeting with me. You can whine and you can vent. And then after that, we're going to create an action plan. And then the second follow-up meeting, I'm going to ask you what you've done with your action plan. If you haven't done anything on your action plan, that's it. I'm done. I'm not a right-brained HR person. I'm not the nice jelly bean on the desk type person. I am very much on, if you want something as an employee, you need to speak up for it. Your manager shouldn't do everything. And so in some organizations, for performance agility, we have the employees fill out the form and set the meeting with their managers. Because if you don't want feedback, we're not going to waste our time. So I talk about managing upward. If you're not getting the information that you want, you need to be accountable. You need to ask your manager. I also say there's a very respectful way of doing that. So I have a workshop for employees on how to get the most out of your performance discussion or your check-in. How do you ask the questions? How do you ensure you're clear on expectations? When I'm ending up terminating employees, often there's a gap in understanding. Oh, I never knew I was supposed to do that. I just talked to somebody yesterday on somebody who had an issue, and I said, have you talked to the manager? No. Well, how do you expect the manager to know what's going on? Well, I don't know. So, there's you need to train your employees to take ownership of a lot of their day as well. I'm quite happy to keep answering questions if you have some. I've got more slides, so whatever you wish, I go with the flow. We have, I think, just about 25 minutes left, so I've got other things, as I said, but
Val, I think there was one question from Oliver. I just want you to repeat those 4 questions that you use at the check-in with people, where it was, what are they currently working on?
Yeah, so I did that. So I'm going to type them in right now.
If anybody has any specific questions for either Gareth or I, happy to open the floor up too. But Valerie also has more slides.
Well, maybe go practical and talk a bit what an engagement with a fractional HR consultant would look like for a company. What should they budget? How do they make sure they get the right person for them?
So typically what I do, I won't speak for others. What I do is I do it an audit. So I sit down with an organization, and that checklist that's on my website, I go through that in more detail. I ask for, in advance, send me all the documents that you have. It takes probably about 10 to 12 hours. And I go through everything that the company has. I ask questions of the stakeholders. What are your, how do you handle this? How do you handle this? What are your properties for that? What issues do you have? What are your goals in terms of your hiring plan? What are your goals in terms of, is there a liquidity event coming up? So I go through all that and I come back with a plan, and it will come back with a setup part of it. Let's get you up and running and done properly. And then that ongoing will be a recommendation as to, hey, I think there's not much happening right now. You're probably good with just an as needed, so you can call me up when you need me. It'll be kind of maybe a few hours a month, or you're about to be fairly active. I think you should have, I can come in 1 day a week or more. I'm more of an advisor, but I think you should get some sort of part-time resource, and I can work with you to help you, or I think you need an in-house. So I go through that whole audit process with those companies, and then we define what their HR should look like. Okay, so questions are in the chat box. Employee relations. So just another aspect of it's ongoing. Employees do need someone other than the owner or managers to speak with. Again, I am very accountable. So if somebody comes to me, an employee comes to me, I really try to make them as self-sufficient as possible. My goal is helping them solve their own problem. Now, if that means I just need to give them some help with the wording, that's fine. If I need to meet on their behalf, I'll do that. If I need to facilitate, that's fine. But more I can do to make them self-sufficient, I will. 2021, the issues are there are a lot more mental health issues and family challenges with people working remotely and at home. Everybody's seen all of those kids running across the back and dogs barking. And I think some people, I find that probably about 20% love working from home full time, 20% really need to get back to the office, and the other 60% would like a bit of a mix where they can work, have some social interaction, maybe a day or two a week, or stay home. So mental health issues are coming up. You can get employee and family assistance programs. Your benefits programs will have those. Those are crisis counseling that is available for employees. And then there needs to be, you need to get creative. There needs to be more social activities because I find that, that dropping in by the water cooler or the lunchroom, that doesn't happen. And so you need to be more proactive. Okay, just a couple of questions coming in. Salary versus wage. I think is that a question on, do I pay a salary or do I do an hourly? That, David, would you?
Yeah. At what point do we go from paying somebody hourly to paying them a monthly salary?
Okay, so the way you pay them, I'm presuming you're asking like hourly versus overtime and things like that. Because that's usually why people have them on hourly versus salary.
Yes. And having to keep track of their time.
Yeah, so the method of payment has nothing to do with whether they're eligible for overtime or not, and that's clearly stated in employment standards. It's the nature of the job. So I've heard somebody say, well, I've got this office assistant, I'm paying them $40,000 a year, so they're not eligible for overtime. Unfortunately, that's an incorrect assumption. So any hourly should be part-time. If they're working full-time, it's easier to make them a salary. The nature of their job determines whether they're subject to overtime or not. So a $40,000 office assistant who's working overtime, you equate that, which is roughly about $19 an hour. If you're using a 40-hour work week, you still need to pay them overtime. So if you pay somebody salary and they are maybe putting in a few extra minutes at the end of the day because you don't want a clock watcher, that for the most part balances off to the fact that they might take a personal call. So as long as the person's getting their work done and it's all balancing off, great. But if you have an office assistant that you want them to spend a couple hours at the end of the day doing a special project, you either have to pay them time and a half, or you can create an averaging agreement and say you get straight time, but I'm going to give you 2 hours off next week in lieu. So like, I'm not going to get into too many details. For your software developers, engineers, electrical engineers, they are exempt from overtime. So salary versus hourly doesn't matter. Then if you pay them hourly and they work 42 hours and they send you a bill for 42 hours, yeah. But if they're going to be working full-time, put them on salary. Next question. Can you speak? Yep.
I was going to say there's the question about disciplinary actions for smaller but significant issues such as missing deadlines.
Yes. So setting up, so somebody who's a chronic underperformer is not on the performance agility. We actually have a specific performance improvement plan for them. And so if it's a little bit like, significant issues, missing deadlines, maybe the gap in the first check-in is, hey, you missed some key deadlines. We're going to address it by, and we'll have a plan. But if it becomes a significant issue, we're now sitting down with them and saying, here are your shortfalls. This is what you need to do to correct them. These are our expectations. And we're going to be reviewing this on a every 2 weeks or whatever the appropriate gap is. So we put them on a performance improvement plan. And if it continues, it gets more and more serious, such as this is a verbal warning and this is a warning. And if you do this again, you could be terminated. Something you absolutely possibly, if you're going to be doing that path, you need an expert in HR to help you write those letters. This can get off track very poorly. You also need, when you're going through the disciplinary action, to ensure that it's not, they're not having problems because of a health issue or something that needs accommodation. So for example, if you've got somebody who's perpetually late in the morning, you need to ask them, is there anything that's making it difficult for you to come in the morning? They might say, yeah, I'm on medication right now. It's really difficult for me to get in at 8:30. And a reasonable accommodation might be saying, okay, well, you can work 10 to 6 instead. And so you know, it's a complicated part, but it is something that needs to be done with somebody who knows what they're doing. Okay, and
On those disciplinary, yeah, like I say, everything that we've had today, you just have to put it in writing and make sure
over document,
clearly state like this isn't happening. This is what we want to see going forward. Is that hit? If it's not hit, then you go to the next stage, and you just got to if you're at the point where you're having to document things, it's probably not going to work. And you just figuring out how to transition out of the business at that point. So.
Yeah. And you know, you should document like everything right from the start, because most of the times when people come to me and they say, I want to fire this person, and I go, okay, let's go over your documentation. There is none. You know, they've had a few casual conversations and then there's none. And so over document. You don't have to share documentation with the employee, but you should be keeping notebooks. And just so you know, employees have access to their files under the personal Information Protection Act. And so when you're writing things, assume they are going to read them. So things like, that guy's an idiot, he's always late, is probably not something you want to put in writing. So things like, he was late on such and such a date, or I overheard him make an inappropriate comment and this is what we did to deal with it. So just assume that anything you put in writing will be read by someone.
Yeah, labor laws are not in the employer's favor.
Right.
They're not
Right.
there to protect employers.
No. And you can let somebody go without cause. It's exactly that, without cause. There's no rhyme or reason. You can do it. Just make sure your employment agreement's right. And the only thing you can't do is if it's,
right.
Pardon?
BC is a pretty employer-friendly environment compared to most places I've been in, whether it's France, the UK, other markets. I mean, BC, as far as letting people go without cause, is that's unheard of in lots of countries out there. I know that we're always looking at ourselves saying how friendly it is to the employees, but I just say when you compare this internationally, BC is pretty employer friendly, I have to say.
You know, so you can do it without cause for anything except a human rights violation. So if somebody is ill or has a disability or is not the right gender or whatever, you can't do that. But outside of that, without cause is without cause.
Valerie, kind of
ideas and thoughts on a flexible
an
time
interesting point.
policy.
You know, by the time
sorry,
people have come to you and said, I want to fire. I was just going to say it's an interesting point. And Gareth, you sort of said you've had to do this. You have to document lots of things. How and usually when it gets to that point, it's beyond hope. Did you find as you grew that there were cases where you wish you had taken those steps earlier? Did you try too hard or too long to salvage things with employees that didn't end up working out at the end of the day? I mean,
I don't think you ever let anyone go and go, crikey, that was too fast.
Mhm.
I think everybody always goes, well, I wish I did that 6 months ago. As you go forward, but human nature, you want to take care of your team, you want to take care of people, but on that side, the biggest thing is getting that overall process in place so that it isn't getting to somebody walking in your office being like, hey, I want to fire this person over here. I have no documentation. I don't have any backup in this. So that it's an iterative process where you're like, I have concerns with this employee. Then you come back in 3 months after, it's like, actually, this person isn't working out. As you go forward, because a lot of it's been like, being a gong show of being a high growth company and not laying out clear expectations. As Valerie's saying, the employee hasn't spoken up, but Clear has a duty of care for the employees to be giving them a framework where they can ask those questions and can feel like they're in that environment there. So often with performance issues there's also an issue with Clear not being effective at laying out what the expectations were, but also staff not communicating their expectations on the framework. So the performance reviews are like really that two-way street where you can build what are the expectations for this quarter, what are my accountabilities, but what are our values and what are our goals. Those are our kind of three pillars as we go through the quarter that everyone is very clear of it as you go forward. So when you do have those performance issues, they just get discovered faster. You can figure stuff out, but it's growing quickly. Everyone the hardest thing growing quickly is you got 70 people who've never worked together before trying to get them to communicate effectively in a short amount of time is a huge challenge, and it's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately. So
the other thing to keep in mind is if you don't deal with it properly, based on my experience, which is unscientific, more than 50% of the time I've had poor performers either go on stress leave or file a harassment complaint. Because of course, they're getting pressured to do the work correctly, and reasonable management action is not harassment. So you are allowed to give people discipline. You are allowed to tell people that they've got shortfalls. That is not harassment. But unfortunately, poor performers do that either because they're stressed and they're not doing their work, so they go to their doctor and go on stress leave, or they know they can completely avoid it, because as soon as they bring up a stress leave, go on stress leave, or file a harassment complaint, we have to put the whole disciplinary process on hold for potentially 2 years. We have to, somebody could go on leave, and for, it could be 2 years or more that we're stuck with this person in our organization on leave dealing with this. So, first of all, as Gareth said, is make sure your expectations are clear up front. Have regular communication with your employees. When they're going off track, catch them early and deal with it. And when you've made the decision that they are not a fit, get them out of there. Get them out of there. The number of times where somebody said, okay, I'm finally ready, I'm going to fire them tomorrow, and a stress leave note comes in. And I even tell the managers, you need to do it soon, because I think there's a stress leave note coming soon. And sure enough, a stress leave note comes up. And so you absolutely positively need to keep your processes clean and have these forthright, honest, but compassionate conversations with employees. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be an awful thing. And I've seen a number of employees turn around and they go, oh, I didn't realize I was supposed to do that. Okay, I can do that. And so our goal is not to fire somebody, or our goal is not to create our case to prevent the lawsuit. Our goal is first and foremost to see if we can make this person a success.
And it also impacts all your other employees, right? If you've got effective performance management, if you've got someone who's underperforming in the team, that just impacts everybody around them there. So the company seeing that there's a there was a good, reasonable expectation you're going to be supported there. It doesn't, that person who may have performance issues, it impacts the entire business. So it's just good to get it right.
Yeah. Question on create a flexible time policy. For example, person needs to put in 40 hours, but can choose how to disperse them: 10 hours one day, 6 the next. If they are exempt from overtime, your high-tech workers, your managers, you can have them on salary, and then you can say, yeah, this is flexible. You'll be working like 4 10-hour work. You don't really need it in you don't need it documented to the same level. If it's a non-exempt, like a clerical person that you want to work 10 hours one day and 6 hours another, you need what's called an averaging agreement. You can find that, what an averaging agreement is on the Employment Standards worksite, but basically you can average, you can create a schedule that is not 5 days, 8 hours, but adds up to 40. And it can also average over a period of 4 weeks. So it could be 45 hours one week and 35 hours the next week. So like an on again, off again shift. And you can have that and not have to pay time and a half. You just need to document it and need to create an averaging agreement.
We are clear on that. Like, we're obviously dealing with high paid software developers and everything else around. We basically say you have your sprints, so every 2 weeks of work, you have to deliver on that. And your ability to book holidays is just contingent on keeping your team happy. Your roadmap, you can take time off whenever you want, as long as your team isn't being let down by whatever it is. And the same on the hours that they work as well. Is you can work 7 days a week, 1 week, and 3 the next if you want, as long as you're delivering on what you need and your team can rely on you and you're available there. It's harder for the customer-facing staff because they have to be available for those calls. But the general premise is you're an adult, deliver on your work, and and we'll work with that there.
Some companies will also have core hours. So they've said we want everybody available between 10 and 2 so that we know we can schedule meetings. So you can start anytime before 10 and you can, just as long as you're there until 2. So you can have some flexibility, but as it's so for your professionals, You can be more informal about it, but anybody who is non-exempt from overtime, like your clerical workers, they need to have an averaging agreement.
Because of mental health as well, with the global workforce we've like even the core meetings for the business, the all hands, we've said everyone can access the recordings afterwards. Just having staff in Europe, India, here in North America, trying to get everybody on those calls is interesting. So we've got to the point now where we're just like, you can follow the recordings afterwards, but you're going to be in check-in discussions and stuff like that afterwards. So it's interesting with COVID and global work. And I think the context of the business is so freaking key for this stuff. So.
Any other questions? I can also. The next one is some strategic before I've got a few other ones. One of the things that we're now starting to think about is what is the post-COVID workforce going to look like? So I had one company that did not allow any remote work. And I just finished doing what are called stay interviews. So instead of exit interviews, I sat down with all 24 employees one-on-one, what's working, what's not working, what do you need from your manager, what's the company doing well? Various questions. And the biggest thing that came out of it was we weren't allowed to work from home. And now that we've for a year demonstrated that the company can run just fine with us working home, will we be allowed to after the pandemic's over? So that the company said, yeah, sure. And so now we're starting to plan. I have another company that is doing a complete analysis right now on whether they're going, how many are going to come back afterwards. And it could be between their head office had about 75, and they're thinking it could be anywhere between 6 and 70 that come back. They don't know. So people are now starting to look at what their post-COVID workforces are going to be. What have we learned from this? And what's important in the culture that came out of this? And so that's one of the strategic pieces that have come out. Coaching is something that look for coaches, whether it's me as an HR person or being part of Foresight is where you've got the EIR program. Shameless plug for Foresight. That's why they're there. That's why we're here, is that, business owners are great at their technical talents. And there's a very old book called The E-Myth that talks about, they use a baker, and somebody who's told, you're a great baker, you should open a bakery, right? And of course, the whole thing falls apart. And so remember that you are good at what you are technically, but get the coaching that you need to get that area up. Just a couple of, I think I've talked about most of this already because I'm just watching the time. We're almost wrapping up. Yeah, I can always go into this lately, but I did promise. There you go. That's my website. That if you go there and you go to resources, there is the checklist of what you need to have in place. And there's also the when do you engage HR in a little bit more detailed discussion paper that I've put together. So I'm really, hard part is I don't get to see all of you in person, but I'm really happy that I was able to get some super questions.
Great, thank you very much. I think that pretty much brings us to a couple minutes left. I want to thank Gareth and Charles for coming in and sharing your experiences, what you've gone through, what you've seen as your companies went from a wonderful little founding team to a much larger organization, how you infuse your values, how you keep that going, how you bring on the right people, and how you show that. How did you refer to it, Valerie? Positive churn? Was that the word?
But yeah, positive turnover. Yeah,
positive turnover. There you go. And I mean, these are the realities. And I think the value of your organization is so tied up in the people who are in it and running it and the skills that they bring. And so bringing in the right people, doing that mindfully, doing it. Obviously, there are the legal requirements, but that is really just the start of it. As Valerie says, there's so much more to that HR function of allowing people to feel heard, allowing people the communication tools and channels that they can ask for what they need and feel supported, and make sure that you do get the best out of them, which was certainly some comments throughout of how do you maximize the performance from people and how do you let them know and keep them on track. So I think it's a great conversation we had. I really appreciate everyone's time here today to share with the group. As always, I love a good active chat and the conversation discussions and making sure that it answers your needs. Another shameless plug for Foresight on that coaching and mentorship. We do have our peer mentorship groups that you can look into around different roles, CEO, CTO, and on the executive growth for COOs and CFOs. So if you're looking for specifically chatting with other people who might be facing your challenges, seeing how they're doing it, seeing what they're implementing, that's another way to get some support. Though obviously for some things, as we mentioned, you know, employment lawyers will want to look at contracts or turn to people who are professionals at it when it comes to sticky situations to keep yourself out of court. One of those things where a stitch in time saves 9, or an ounce of prevention.
Penny wise, pound foolish.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll keep going on the sayings here. It is now 11:30 in BC, which brings us to the end of our 90 minutes. I will release you all. We do have one more webinar coming up in April around media and communicating the message and using them effectively. So look forward to those invites. Thank you again to everybody who was here today.
Thank you.
Awesome. Cheers.